My name is Kristen Wise, and I'm here today with Clara Benson. And before I go any further with introductions, I just wanted to point out that we're not wearing masks. We are the only two indoors, except for one person up in the balcony who's masked. We are vaccinated, have not had any high-risk COVID exposures, don't have symptoms, and discussed in advance that we're comfortable with that. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, again, my name is Kristen Wise. I'm the current vice president of Circular Congregational Church. And today, Clara Benson and myself will be just sharing a little bit about our religious upbringing, what drew us here to Circular, but mostly we're going to focus on some of the history of the UCC so we can kind of see how Circular got to be where it is today. So personally, my background is Lutheran. I'm actually 14th generation Lutheran, going all the way back to Martin Luther himself. My father his first career was a Lutheran pastor as well. So I was very involved in the church growing up. After going to college, like most people, life just gets a little busier. I started going to church a little bit more infrequently and just didn't really have a good church home. So when I moved to Charleston in 2012, I had reached out to my aunt who lived in Raleigh, and I'd said, I like your church. Is there something in Charleston that you would recommend? She looked into it, got back, and she suggested Circular, which has been a wonderful fit. So Clara Benson is a retired UCC minister. It was a second change career, and I'll let her describe a little bit more to you.
Kristen. I think I'm the exception other than the rule, as I am a cradle UCC member. Well, actually, the United Church of Christ was formed after I was born, but I did grow up in one of the denominations that was one of the parent organizations that eventually became the United Church of Christ. My first career was as a military spouse. The second one was a mental health professional. And then finally I was able to fulfill my call in the ministry and was ordained in the United Church of Christ. Prior to my retirement, in 2012, I began struggling with where we would go in retirement. And after a lot of prayer and thought, I found Circular, because I wanted to come to a place where I could continue to grow and serve, and that held the progressive theology that I embraced. And I really feel blessed to be a part of this community of faith.
Yeah. And for me, I was looking for a church also that was progressive, and just looking at some of the statements that the UCC strongly supports and seeing them expressed here at Circular just really resonated with me. They look at the recognition of our faith is rooted in the life and the teachings of Jesus. And they take the Bible seriously, but not literally, and just really encourage open, critical minds and just committed hearts. So some of the things that I like is there is an emphasis to welcome all, love all, and justice for all. And this really spans racial and ethnic backgrounds. This spans gender identities and expressions, sexual orientations, and life experiences. And that's very important to me. So that's one of the things that helped bring me and keep me to Circular. So Clara, I'm wondering how the UCC came to be so progressive.
That's a good question, Kristen, and I think it comes from our history in the United Church of Christ. And if we understand that, we begin to get a sense of our strengths and our growing edges. Our foremothers and forefathers in the faith go back to the beginning of our country. The Pilgrim separatists who came to this country in 1620 and the Puritans in 1628 formed the Congregational Church. Both groups wanted freedom from the Church of England, and they wanted to govern themselves, believing each person had the right and responsibility of leadership and freedom of conscience. The Christian Church was formed in 1820 as a distinctively American frontier movement. This denomination was a pioneer in providing educational opportunities for women, establishing co-educational colleges, and furthering the abolitionist movement. The Congregational Church and the Christian Church joined to form the Congregational Christian Church in 1929. So that's one of the branches of the UCC. And what they held in common was this fierce sense of independence, autonomy, leadership of the laity, and freedom to dissent, and also a desire to work together in mission. Then in the 1700s, the German reforms fleeing persecution in Germany came in through Philadelphia, settled in Pennsylvania, and then they came down the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania. And then they began to go east in North Carolina, and it looks like once they started getting to the flatlands, they stopped, perhaps because it no longer looked like Germany. That church in the Piedmont where I grew up was formed in 1750. And the Germans were later joined by reformers from Switzerland, Hungary, and other countries. Then in 1872, another wave of immigrants fleeing persecution in Europe were called the Evangelicals, and they came in through New Orleans up the Mississippi. Some went a little bit east, but most moved to the west. Then in 1934, the Evangelicals and Reformed Church was formed, and what they shared in common was their mostly German heritage. But also, again, there was a desire for freedom in conscience, an educated clergy, and they too joined together to work in mission. June the 25th, 1957, the Congregational Christian Church and the Evangelical and Reformed Church became the United Church of Christ. The motto taken from John 17, that they may all be one. And as of 2020, the UCC is made up of approximately 4,852 churches and over 802,000 members. Some local churches decided not to join because you will still see ENR churches, Reformed, Congregational, etc. But many also chose to retain the parent name and then add the new identity. And therefore here we are called Circular Congregational, honoring our history, but also Circular Congregational UCC.
So that was a lot of information. That's wonderful, Clara. So you can find all of that information on ucc.org and actually even more information. So it sounds like the UCC was really made from a lot of dissenters. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, we've been dissenting, I think, since our birth or our foremothers and forefathers were born. And much of our dissenting has been around justice. We were also the first historically white denomination to ordain an African American in 1785, the first to ordain a woman, Antoinette Brown, in 1853, the first to ordain an openly gay man in 1972, and the first Christian church to affirm the right to same-gender couples to marry in 2005. And we have been at the forefront of anti-slavery and civil rights issues. So you see, the history is clear. Our forebears wanted autonomy and a right to dissent without fear of recrimination from the hierarchy.
And speaking of like different levels of hierarchy, each church has its own polity, which is kind of a way of saying governance or looking at the organizational structure. And so some groups, like Catholics, are very top-down in their polity. And so they have a pope, bishops, the priests for individual cathedrals are chosen. Other denominations like Methodists also have bishops and have their ministers or their pastors chosen for their individual churches. Where I came from, being raised Lutheran, we were able to call our own pastors, but we still had bishops and synods that our church was formed in. So here at UCC, it's sort of the opposite. It's very bottom up. So individual churches, they have their own constitution, they have their own bylaws, they own their own property. They call their own pastors, which I was accustomed to from the Lutheran Church. And so UCC churches do, though, have a covenant with sort of the wider church. And it's not legally binding and it's not dictated, but it is definitely adhered to and mutually respected. So I'll let Clara tell us a little bit more about the covenant relationships.
Yes, Kristen, covenant is very important in the United Church of Christ. And one of the ways that we keep our covenant relationship with the wider church is through involvement in associations and conferences based on our geographical proximity. There are 38 conferences in the UCC, and we're in the Southeast Conference, which is a large conference geographically. It's made up of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, most of Mississippi, all of Tennessee except for Memphis, and the panhandle of Florida. Our conference office is now virtually in Atlanta. Our transitional conference minister has been the Reverend Char Birch, but at the end of September, our new conference minister will be the Reverend Kimberly Wood. The United Church of Christ has a board of directors and a collegium of officers. Our president is the Reverend Dr. John Doreyer, and the national office is in Cleveland. And just as local churches have an annual meeting each year to elect officers, establish the budget, and set a vision for the coming year, so do conferences and the national church. The Southeast Conference, of which we are part, as I stated, has an annual meeting each year in June, and churches send delegates to that. The national church has a meeting called a General Synod every 2 years, and here the business of the wider church is conducted by delegates from all the conferences, budgets are established, visions are set forth, and resolutions are passed. The General Synod speaks to the local church, not for, again emphasizing our covenant, but not that hierarchy that is in some other denominations.
Prior to being the vice president, I was the financial secretary, so I can speak to offering in the UCC. So on Sundays when we collect the offering, some of it is to support ourselves, to pay our staff, our mortgage, keep the utilities on, but we also tithe to the UCC. And so it's the sort of participating organization is referred to as our church's wider mission. You'll see the abbreviation OCWM, or hear the term, as Clara's been saying, wider church. And so they have emphasis on several different areas. One is really taking care of the UCC ministers. They have global initiatives that they follow up with, and then they really work to support justice initiatives. So the UCC partners with over 200 mission partners to fight injustices both here and abroad. So when we tithe to the church here at Circular, we take that very seriously. We recognize that our pooled resources can really impact to make a big difference. So you'll hear as you go through, there'll be several Sundays that have special offerings. And each time we'll explain what they are and what they represent, but I just want to throw out a few names for you to listen to in the future. There is One Great Hour of Sharing, there's Strengthen the Church, Neighbors in Need, and the Christmas offering for clergy in financial need. So again, as those come up, we'll talk about it, but that's sort of an overview of offering within the UCC.
Our covenant relationship is also important as the national church provides information and guidelines for the search and call process for our pastors, educational resources, information about best practices, insurance for both clergy and staff, and insurance for our building, and also disaster relief. This is a lot of information, so again, I invite you to go to the UCC website and also to ucc.org. There you will find lots of information and hopefully have any questions answered that you may have. Again, I want to thank you so much for your time and interest in Circular. And I really look forward to meeting you on Zoom, and even more importantly, I look forward to meeting you in person, hopefully before too long. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for listening to Clara and I today.